Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Audibility. My name is Heather Canlis-Rigg, and I'm Gallery TPW's curatorial resident. For visually impaired folks, I'm going to self-describe myself. I'm a brown woman of Southeast Asian descent. I have dark brown hair and brown eyes, and I'm wearing a brown shirt. I'm in the room of a home that has white walls and brown doors that are blurred out using the blur zoom function. To start today, Gallery TPW acknowledges that we live, work, and create on stolen land. We occupy the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original custodians of this land. Tkaronto was part of Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which reminds us that we all share the same bowl and spoon, therefore we must take only what we need to allow for continued abundance and future viability. The staff of Gallery TPW are working together to better understand and acknowledge our implication in settler imperial violence through reading groups and discussions. We are asking ourselves, how can this learning be applied to our programming, structure, and governance as an artist-run center? Gallery TPW is doing a lot of programming this year that explores sound and language. And in preparing today's land acknowledgement, we couldn't help but think about the languages that are indigenous to Turtle Island that colonial forces sought to eradicate. To share some of the research that we did, I'm going to read an excerpt from Robin Wall Kimmerer's 2013 book entitled Braiding Sweetgrass, which explores the Anishinaabe language Potawatomi. I'm sure that there are some folks here who have read Braiding Sweetgrass, and for those who haven't, I myself have not read it in full. It is written in the first person. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from a chapter titled Learning the Grammar of Animacy. So Kimmerer writes, had history been different, I would likely speak Bodawad Mimwin or Potawatomi, an Anishinaabe language. But like many of the 350 indigenous languages of the Americas, Potawatomi is threatened and I speak the language you read. The powers of assimilation did their work as my chance of hearing that language, and yours too, was washed from the mouths of Indian children in government boarding schools where speaking your native tongue was forbidden. Children like my grandfather, who was taken from his family when he was just a little boy of 9 years old. This history scattered not only our words, but also our people. Today, I live far from our reservation, so even if I could speak the language, I would have no one to talk to. But a few summers ago, at our yearly tribal gathering, a language class was held and I slipped into the tent to listen. There was a great deal of excitement about the class because, for the first time, every single fluent speaker in our tribe would be there as a teacher. When the speakers were called forward to the circle of folding chairs, they moved slowly, with canes, walkers, and wheelchairs, only a few entirely under their own power. I counted them as they filled the chairs, 9 fluent speakers in the whole world. Our language, millennia in the making, sits in those 9 chairs. The words that praised creation, told the old stories, lulled my ancestors to sleep, rest today in the tongues of 9 very mortal men and women. And language is very much at the root of our talk today with Casey Messia, entitled Queer Diaspora and the Sounds That Mark My Words. This is the first of 3 programs in our Audibility Speaker Series, which is taking place online throughout the year. Casey is a Toronto-based professor and musician whose research examines sound as a mode of affective, psychic, and social representation, specifically in relation to diasporic experience. Her work draws on sound, queer diaspora, and Filipinic studies to consider how sensorial encounters are enmeshed and disciplined by social and psychic conditions. TPW's extended thinking and research on sound, music, and language diasporas stems from the work we are doing with Brooklyn-based artist Jessie Chun, whose solo exhibition opens at Gallery TPW in 2 weeks today, on March 17th. Jessie's work addresses language and its politics to uncover new translations toward poetry, opacity, and the untranslatable. And in thinking about the untranslatable and about audibility, it recently occurred to me that I cannot at this moment verbally tell you the title of Jessie's exhibition. And that's because the title is in both Korean and English. And while I have known the title of this exhibition for quite some time, And I've had lovely, rich conversations with Jessie about what the title means to her and how it relates to her practice and her TPW exhibition. It wasn't until a few days ago that I realized I cannot audibly share the title with you. And I did do some preliminary research and practicing of the Korean aspect of the title, and Google is great in that Google can make it audible for me. And in listening to it, it was very difficult for me to imagine myself making those sounds and saying those words. But I do hope to change that. The exhibition is on for 2 months, so I do have time to practice. And perhaps during the exhibition or by the second program of Audibility, I can share it with you. And Annie has put it in the chat so that you can see it. It is interesting for me to think about language as, in this context as audio and visual. But on this note, this sort of untranslatable audible note, I'm going to turn things over to Casey, and there will be time for a Q&A with Casey after the talk. Thank you so much for joining us today, Casey. It's been so lovely to be in dialogue with you over the last few months.
Thanks so much, Heather. So I'll just take a moment to describe myself as well. Hi, my name is Casey Messia. I'm a smallish brown woman with short black hair, and I'm wearing a black turtleneck. So thank you for the kind invitation to be here with you today. I'm grateful for your time and generous attendance. A special thank you to Heather Rigg, Annie Wong, and everyone at TPW for organizing this speaker series on language, sound, and music inspired by Jessie Chun's incredible exhibition. So I've prepared a 40-ish minute presentation broken into 3 parts. I begin with a close reading of Jessie's work, Soleil. I'll then share my own theorizing of sound in relation to queer diaspora. And I'll end with a bit of autobiography in the form of a video for a song I wrote in 2016 called Sounds That Mark Our Words. This song and video aesthetically and sonically elaborate the queerness of diaspora. I propose that my own work shares a kinship to Chun's work Soleil in its attempt to represent and make sense of the synchronicities of racialized desires that are in excess of semiotic and Eurocentric reasoning. It was such a profound pleasure to spend time with Chun's art, as it reminded me of how sound in its most ambiguous and queer forms can hold the contingencies of history, language, memory, family, and the genealogies of loss that mark these sites of colonial dispossession. In Soleil, Chun has created an encounter with the grammars of polyphony, a simultaneity of sounds that are both restrained by and resistant to the imposition of English on the Korean diaspora. Through what Chun has described as a form of, quote, unlanguaging, quote, her audience is witness to new meanings produced through the abstraction, manipulation, and redaction of sounds and symbols from the English language. Soleil poses confrontation with the political potential and limits of colonial language as a structuring device for feeling. Her work inspires me to meditate on the felt vibrations of language and how the sound of language can produce affective and psychic depths. So I'm going to now play a short excerpt of Soleil taken from the artist's website in order to give you more context around my reading of her work. And I'll just pull that up now. Shh.
b, t, d, k, g, v, v, s, z, sh, j, ch, p, j, b, t, d, p, k, b, g, t, d, k, p, k, p, b, t, d, p, k.
Part 1, the consonant. I think Chen's work is deeply provocative for what it does to language, specifically its highlighting of consonant sounds. Sule is a single channel video that draws from Gangang Sule. From Chen's work, I've learned that this is a Korean seasonal harvest and fertility ritual that integrates song and dance and is typically performed by women under the glow of moonlight. The participants hold hands, forming a circle that through their movement expands, disassembles, and changes its form. The songs can be both impromptu or predetermined and encourages the participants to express their feelings in chorus with one another. Diana Seo-Hung Lee suggests that historically the dance was meant to provide a forum for its participants to express emotions connected to living within patriarchal systems of power and oppression. She writes, quote, "The women participating would not have been able to, in their everyday lives, sing, speak loudly, nor leave the house at night in the patriarchal society of ancient Korea. This dance was a license for their one release," end quote. Drawing attention to the transits of diaspora and history through the creation of an unconventional index of language, Sule can be better understood through what Billy Ray Belcourt describes as the low hum of context. In her work, Korean history becomes a low hum of context that structures an audience's encounter, with Korean diaspora. According to a publication about Sule released by the Blackwood Gallery in Mississauga, Ontario, Chen's video combines archival clips of Gangang Sule, index pages from intonation books, images of Hangul, and English consonants and audio splices from YouTube tutorials on how to pronounce English correctly. In the video, what might otherwise be taken for granted as the quotidian tonalities of communication, here language becomes unhinged from expectation, but at the same time given form through history. In the work, the sound of the English language is disembodied and spliced into phonemic pulses. This editing and manipulation of English sounds is intentional. In an interview with Artforum, Jessie shares, "Taking the sound apart, but still keeping it within the conceptual framework of English made me think about what else is embedded in making a language. English is tied up with legacies of imperialism. There's so much unseen violence that is a part of how this language is institutionalized." I find it very powerful that what remains after the edits in Sule is an inventory of sounds that disrupts the primacy of the vowel as central to English word construction and thus central to colonial imagination. Sule opens with the sound sh, a pairing of consonant sounds that is often associated with insisting on silence, a sound meant to reprimand. Shh, Chun extracts and places this sound in a new aesthetic landscape that is independent and unregulated by colonial schemas of enunciation and translation. When removed from their phonetic relations to vowels, when listened to on their own, the sound of consonants undoes the presumptive structuring or potential reprimand of English. In Soleil, we are meant to experience the fullness of the consonant's timbre. Sh, p, d, t, k. These edited clips of sound originally meant to instruct and assimilate speech into English pronunciations now serve a different function. For me, they secure Chun's political orientation, one that is about crafting a world that involves the careful consideration of the logistics, function, and embedded emotions of the sounds that inhabit it. In speech, consonant sounds are meant to break up the intended agenda of vowels. The sh, p, d, t, k are antithetical to the circle or the rounded mouth needed to voice a vowel sound. Unlike the openness of a vowel, producing consonant sounds involves a narrowing of the vocal tract. This narrowing is referred to as constriction or the obstruction of breath, whereby sound is produced by a form of corporeal tension. Consonant sounds also demand all the mechanics of the mouth, the lips, the teeth, the tongue, and the palate. Shh requires the corners of the lips to lower rather than rounding. The lips become pursed and teeth become exposed. Parts of the mouth are drawn in, the soft palate is raised, and the tongue reaches upwards towards the roof of the mouth without touching it. And then the tip of the tongue lowers behind the teeth. Shh. Anne Carson reminds us that, quote, the importance of vowels to human speech has remained. There are words in English without consonants, but so central are vowels to word construction that there isn't a word in English that doesn't include a vowel. While all language contain their own unique set of vowels and consonants, and I'm neither an expert in English nor Korean linguistics or phonology, today I want to talk about the sounds that pulled me into this work. Like Chun, I realized that my conceptualizing of language is within an English framework. But my hope is that when we turn to the affective and when we begin to pull language apart, something new, something resistant is produced. In thinking with Soleil, I'm interested in what becomes possible in the absence of the vowel. So I turn to the interruptive potential of consonant sounds to affect and incite methods of communication outside of those steeped in colonial dominance. What does it mean to de-emphasize the function of vowel sounds in language and reorient our listening to the consonant? What do consonant sounds teach us about the sonics of race that underwrite hierarchies of language? What methods of communication become possible when we do away with words and are left with only their sonic substance? In The Cultural Politics of Emotions, Sara Ahmed implicates emotions as mechanizing our, quote, orientations towards objects and others, end quote. She argues that it is through emotions or how we respond to objects and others that surfaces or boundaries are made. The I and the we are shaped by and even take the shape of contact with others. So for Ahmed, emotions and the spatial are intimately bound, permitting the individual and the social to be constituted as objects. So in other words, our emotions shape our proximities to self and others and are implicated in producing states of isolation and collectivity. Ascribed to sound, Julian Bailey suggests that emotions are communicated, quote, via the pathways of vowels, end quote. Vowels are sounded breath and are produced by rounding the lips in circular shapes. Largely understood as the most sonorous part of the syllable, vowels produce the loudest speech sound. And their capacity for holding larger amplitudes or louder volumes has been linked to the sonic expression of emotion. Bailey also argues that vowel sounds marked the beginning of semantic understandings of emotion. Oohs and ahs and uhs were said to be some of the first guttural articulations of affect that would then be joined with consonants to form words that would come to name and describe emotion. Consonant and vowel sounds map out different functional trajectories by virtue of the shape of mouth and orientation of breath, that these sounds demand. Like Chan, I'm interested in what political orientations become possible when we source emotion elsewhere, beyond the confines of spoken words imposed upon us. In Soleil, Chan empties vowels of their sonic substance, leaving behind traces of fragmented characters and differently shaped circles in their wake. They are stripped of breath and their symbolic value, forming a new method of communication that reroutes expectations of what language as we know it can do and sound like. Like Ganggang Soleil, the vowel is premised on the shape of a circle. But in Sule, Chan provokes us to think about what becomes possible beyond the circular structuring device. What becomes possible beyond the purview of the violent embeddedness of English and its colonial exigencies. Chan has also noted that the moon that hovers above the Ganggang Soleil is yet another site of imperial conquest. In Art Forum, Chan states, "When I look up at it, the moon, to feel comforted or to find solace, I'm reminded of colonial violence, an agenda that's projected onto it. In that way, the moon also reflected how I see language." Chan's turn to consonants signals a reshaping of the colonial frame that does not disavow or idealize the legacies of imperialism on systems of communication, but instead highlights the tensions and obstructions produced in its shadows. Consonants emerge out of collectivity. They are produced through intricate bodily choreographies in the mouth that require both constriction and collaboration. Ganggang Soleil likewise relies on constriction and collaboration. As a group, the participants determine the speed or shape of their dance. They may even become serpentine or separate into smaller circles depending on what the group decides. The dance also provides an aesthetic space for its participants to voice frustration, anger, and tension through song, with the hopes of producing reprieve from gendered hardships. Chan has decided to withhold these songs from her audience. We never hear the women singing. Through this erasure, Chan embeds the consonant sound with affective force, whereby a politics of language and gendered presence is enunciated beyond this form of silencing. The shh is free to take on new meanings and associations. For me, I was reminded of rushing water or gusts of wind, or the sound used to lull my child to sleep, or try to lull my child to sleep with. I was brought into another index of knowing and relating. Consonant sounds are more pragmatic than vowels. They're known for their functionality, for the ways in which they assemble the semantic structure of words, and for their capacities to hold vowels in place, or as Anne Carson describes as, quote, delineating meaning amid the flow of vowel sounds, end quote. The word consonant is a noun, a word used to identify or classify a semantic enclosure that establishes a subject or object. But unlike the word vowel, consonant is also an adjective. A consonant possesses the capacity to describe, to name, to tell us more. Adjectives parcel out descriptional states of being. In this way, they're inherently phenomenological. So Dina Georgis writes, adjectives are not concerned with the certainties of experience, but with the aesthetic representation of what defies definition. Because adjectives describe instead of prescribe, they're more attuned to the senses, to eros, and are associated with the creative impulse in narrative to represent reality and metaphor. Through her assemblage of consonant sounds, Chan is making a deliberate choice to describe and animate a politics of language through refusing its colonial enclosures and turning to the aesthetic in order to hold the excesses of description. In Soleil, Chan refuses the vowel. She doesn't deny its presence, but instead relegates it to the soundless, the unfamiliar, a space of, in her words, quote, untranslatability, end quote. In this undoing, consonants become the emotive force where new meanings and orientations to the sounds that mark our words are forged. Her work encourages me to conceptualize racialized feeling and the feeling of racism as something that can't wholly be contained in words. And yet, hearing some languages feels comforting to diasporic people. That is, hearing Korean languages or Filipinx languages can stir up a blend of affect and ideation that is comforting when whiteness is unsettling. Part 2, the queerness of sound. In the publication Best Letters from Asian Americans in the Arts, reflecting on her grandmother, Lee Ok-sun, Jessie shares memories of her grandmother making up words that didn't make sense to anyone but her. And Chun states, "To this day, I think about all the strange words I missed out on, all the losses I'm carrying from far away. I still think of the time when I spoke one language, and that language was whole." It is this idea of wholeness that animates Chun's preoccupation with the imperial dispossession of language. It is this sight of loss, a wholeness with which one, due to migration, has never really known, and the disjuncture between words, meaning, and their sounds is where I find a relation to Chun in my own thinking on sound. It is indeed a queer feeling to be separated from the language of your parents or your grandparents. So the listening practice that I use in my own research on sound, which is inextricable from my music practice, is cultivated by and calibrated to the experience of growing up in a home filled with sounds that gestured to an elsewhere. Lintik is a Tagalog word for lightning. It is a term often used to disclose the wish for someone to be struck by lightning. Thus, it is a word that connotes feelings of anger and frustration, and also malice. I have strong memories of my mother yelling, "Ay, lintik na," at me as a child. I can hear her now. I can hear her now in my head. It's frightening. "Ay, lintik na." The words and the force with which they were communicated signaled impending doom, signaled impending discipline. I felt the sounds of these words and their affective force through the contours of their vibration, even though I did not understand their semantic meaning. I knew, but I did not know their meaning. My parents migrated from the Philippines to Canada in the mid-1970s. My sisters and I were raised in a smallish city called Brantford, Ontario. We were never taught Tagalog, the most widely spoken language in the Philippines. And we were discouraged from trying to mimic its sounds so that our learning of English would not be interrupted. My parents were fearful that if we spoke their language, we might acquire accents that were, to them, explicit markers of difference. The sound of language, coupled with the demand for its comprehension, is both a project of cultural belonging and one of colonization. The simultaneous geographies of landscape and imagination heard in my parents' accents and in their blend of English and Tagalog, sometimes referred to as Taglish, point to their history of migration and sound out the imperial history of the Philippines. The rolling R's and elongated vowels of Taglish gesture to a somewhere else that is not Canada. In the suburb in which we lived for almost 2 decades, my parents' accents were a queer sound incongruent to the hegemonic demands of the Canadian nation state. The sound of their accents informed the discernment of racial difference and the failure of what Homi Bhabha terms colonial imitation. The description of a sound from my childhood is important to me because it continues to resonate in my understanding of self, precisely because when I listen closer to memories of its force, I must confront biography, histories of race and racialization, and the psychic workings of language. For me, the sounds of Tagalog words transmit affects of diaspora, citizenship, and kinship. My parents continue to use Tagalog as the language with which they speak to one another, and their household has always been a place of gathering for relatives and family friends who use it to communicate. The sonic encounter I had as a child and continue to have with my parents' language prompts me to ask, what feelings are in excess of the word that is spoken? What, as Fred Moten suggests, is the phonic substance that undergirds this particular relationality? To this day, many people expect my Filipinx body to be able to express feelings, affects, sentences, and sounds in Tagalog. But Tagalog was something my parents thought they were protecting me from, as they hoped I would easily be invited into the social fabric of Canadian schools, institutions, and friendships. For me, the sonic dimensions of Tagalog, and relatedly, the sonic interventions made by Sule, which we are meant to feel but do not completely understand, offer an idea of the messy entanglements of sound's material and affective capacities. The Saussurean notion that sound is, quote, a material that language uses, end quote, is particularly conducive to queer theories that invite anti-identitarian considerations of feeling and affect. In the specific familial recollection that I've offered, the dematerialization of language illuminates a queer mode of relating. Queerness is produced when the conditions of sound making offer a lifeline to differently understand the sounds we take for granted. So I now want to share a recent encounter that helped to consolidate my scholarly commitment to the queerness of sound. I try to go for a run in the morning. My route often takes me down a long stretch of road that sits in the middle of artist lofts, a contemporary art museum, and a chocolate factory. These sites and my presence amongst them are a telling convergence given the ongoing gentrification of the Bloor and Sterling neighborhood located in West Toronto. One morning during my run, workers from the Nestle chocolate factory lined the sidewalks. They were on strike. They were demanding that management fulfill a promise to make approximately 80 contract workers permanent employees, and also that the use of precarious work and temporary workers in a full-time capacity was unethical. Some gathered by small fires lit in metal barrels to keep warm, while others held Tim Hortons coffees and chatted under small tents. As I slowly approached, I could hear the faint hum of music coming from speakers. And as if in some fortuitous clash, the moment I came in line with the gathered workers, the lyrics, "Manila, I keep coming back to Manila, simply no place like Manila, I'm coming home," were blasted.
Manila, I keep coming back to Manila. Simply ain't no place like Manila. Manila, I'm coming home.
The sound immediately pulled my attention towards a large group of protesting Filipinx workers who were huddled together and sharing in cheers of defiance as honking cars passed in support of their efforts. The sounds that filled the air signaled multiple social and psychic planes of Filipinx belonging and exclusion. Indeed, many people in the Filipinx diaspora in Canada find employment in factories. I was transported to the winter when my father was locked out of his factory job for 6 weeks due to a rejected union proposal. Sound allowed me to sense the palimpsestic qualities of these temporal moments. Here, sound unexpectedly announced the presence of Filipinx people and narrativized Filipinx trajectories of labor and collectivity. Largely regarded as the unofficial song of the capital of the Philippines, the 1976 anthemic hit called Manila by the Filipino band Hot Dog was dedicated by its composers to the millions of Filipinx workers, sometimes referred to as OFWs or overseas Filipino workers, who labored away from their families in the Philippines. Now, I don't want to suggest that these lives or the lives of the Filipinx workers striking at the chocolate factory that day map neatly onto a single story about Filipinx migration. Rather, I invoke this moment because it exemplifies how a soundscape that encompasses a polyphony of sounds, including pop music, chatter in many languages, including Tagalog, honking horns, and the rumble of transport trucks, can unexpectedly reorient or queer our temporal and spatial understandings of diaspora and reveal converging historical and industrial violences in Canada and in the Philippines. So like Chen, I think sound offers us a methodological framework that can uniquely register modes of collectivity and desires that may otherwise go unrecognized. Broadly, I think that sound has an affective quality that capaciously allows Filipinx diasporic people to create forms of home, love, and belonging that defy racialized descriptions born from racism, colonialism, and their gendered dimensions. Ina Eidsheim suggests that, quote, "the figure of sound is an entity whose existence depends on an objective measurement," end quote. She makes clear that sound is a relational phenomenon that too often becomes processed as a static thing or a knowable object, constrained by its antecedent referent. That is, sound is often reduced within paradigms that seek to stabilize its meaning. So, for example, music is constrained by fixed understandings of genre, pitch, consumption, and duration. And these processes of classification limit how musical sounds are perceived. I'm inspired and indebted to a swell of scholars like Christine Balance and Ashan Crowley, whose work seeks out the psychic, multisensory, and intermaterial potentials of sound in order to move away from presumptive definitions and naturalized conceptions of its function and meaning. Relatedly, my thinking around diaspora recognizes how diasporic cultural production is a site that animates queer relations and queer people in order to problematize affective and psychic regimes of belonging. So I use queerness here to gesture to embodiment and sexuality, but also to a psychosocial history in which Filipinx people have been rendered always already queer to imperial sensibilities. That is, the Philippines and Filipinx people have been treated as non-normative by imperial and colonial forces. This non-normativity can be described as queer. So for queer theorists, queerness not only refers to identitarian notions of sexually and racially marginalized people like myself, but also queerness indexes intimacies, affects, and sounds that are creative. Scholar Kara Keeling describes queerness as both an imposition and a becoming. For her, as an epistemological mode rather than an ontological certainty, queerness is accountable to orientations of desire and non-normative affiliations. So in my research, queerness is a sound that reroutes our relations to social norms and institutional codes and expectations. Queerness is vibrations that can unexpectedly bring us into intimacy with what we might consider abject or repulsive. In this way, we might consider the sounds in Soleil as possessing a queer valence. As both a multisensory phenomenon and metaphorical mode of expression, sound captures affective registers that reconceptualize its potential knowability. Thus, sound and queerness find kinship in ambiguity, where queer denotes a difficulty to pin down, or that which challenges semantic containment. Sound too is on the move because it can be conceived of as vibrations that are what Eidesheim calls unbounded. Their relations are defined by process, articulation, and change across material. Conceiving of sound as vibration is multisensorial, recognizes it as an unfolding phenomenon that moves across bounded surfaces, temporal moments, codified identities, and kinship networks. It also helps to explain how deaf people feel music and reorganizes hierarchies of the senses. In physics, I'm not good at physics, but here's a brief explanation of sound. Sound is a vibration that is processed into an acoustic wave that is then transmitted through and between different mediums. So my thinking and my research dwells on the queerness of sound to show how the sounds of diaspora, as they travel through and between material and affective registers, can be profoundly important. Such sounds potentially provide respite from grief, stir pleasure and joy, act as a conduit for creativity and intimacy, and traverse emotional and geographic borders. Queer sound then is an emotive, expressive, and recuperative force that becomes a condition of possibility. The oscillating tones of my mother's voice as she spoke a blend of English and Tagalog, and my affective reading of this sonic encounter insist on the potential for sound to elicit queer feelings of difference. So to close, I'd like to share my song and video, Sounds That Mark Our Words, combining digital and archival Hi8 footage. Sounds That Mark Our Words explores the relationship between queerness and Filipinx diasporic experience. In this video, my co-director May Trong and I work against notions that coming out is a finite thing or that it's a narrative with a predictable end, a beginning and end. We return to videos from my childhood to understand how my experiences as a kid inform my desires as an adult. In song and video, I grapple with the dual experience of queer desire and Filipinx subjectivity. The title of the song, Sounds That Mark Our Words, references the affective force of language spoken with or without an accent, and the queer desires that rupture normative conventions of loving and listening. My mother and her history of poverty, migration, and kinship provide a framework for exploring the enigmatic yet persistent residues of sound and language. The lines she speaks at the beginning are, "This is what we say, one day, one eat." In an accent, we hear the history of another place. And in the video, I create an aesthetic archive that emphasizes the sonicity of diasporic experience. And I'll just play that now, and I hope that it works.
Because if you are poor, how can you get up higher? I mean, every time you turn around, everything there is unaffordable. You have to survive. One day, one eat. But this is what you say. One day, one eat. One day, sometimes you're lucky you can eat one time.
Through loving, I'm discovering details about myself toward the center of remembering. An immigrant, a consummate, sounds that mark our words.
So I hope that I've offered a sample of my thinking around sound. Thank you again to Jessie Chun for your incredible work and for how it's inspired me. I do hope everyone takes the time to see the exhibit when it opens. Ultimately, the stakes of my scholarship are to create both thought and feeling about sound and diaspora. And there's a way in which I feel a kinship with what Chun has created in Soleil. So that's all she wrote for this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Casey. That was amazing. That was so wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I don't even really know where to begin. Just maybe I'll just share a few things that sort of stood up for me and for all the folks listening. If you could just put your questions in the chat, and we can sort of address them that way. Yeah, I loved how you referred to Jessie's work as disembodied and spliced into pulses, which I thought was a beautiful, apt way to describe it. And same with your sort of referencing of Billy Ray Belcourt, and the low hum of context was really nice, stood out for me as well. And maybe, oh great, so we have a question there. I'm just gonna pull up a couple things here. One is just a quote that I came across through your work. You shared a talk that you did about Pantayo, and you shared this beautiful Anne Carson quote. And I noticed that you referenced Anne Carson earlier today. So I just wanted to share this one, which is, every sound we make is a bit of autobiography. It is totally private, yet its trajectory is public, a piece of the inside projected to the outside, which I like a lot. And I only just came across that just preparing for this talk, and I feel like that sort of relates to a lot of the things that sort of Jessie's sort of grappling with, and that she and I've talked about in terms of like interiority. So thank you for that. I guess one question I have that is sort of a question that we've been grappling with at TPW, and you did touch on this a little bit when you were talking about sound as vibration and reorganizing hierarchies of senses, is how do you, as you have this sort of double practice that's very much interwoven of music and scholarship that is based in sonic listening and sound, and so how do you sort of think through that, or sort of engage with different communities, or sort of rationalize it when thinking about folks that are hard of hearing or how are deaf? And that's a really big question. That's not something that we've answered at TPW yet. But I just wanted to sort of, put that out to you to see how you sort of think about it.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question. So yeah, my theorizing of sound hopes to open up definitions of what sound can be. So sound is, a material force. It can also be an affective and metaphorical force, which I hope that I've helped to describe a bit with my presentation today. And, there's a lot of sound theorists and, critical race theorists, all of these theorists, Tina Campt in particular comes to mind, who theorize sound as, being not just what we perceive through the ear, right? Like when we think about the actual physics of sound, it's a sound wave. It's actually a vibration. It's something that we encounter that touches us in some way. And this touch, this form of touch, may not be something that, physically moves our bodies in any way, but it's there, right? And so, if we conceptualize sound as something that's just not, perceived through the ear, then it opens up the possibilities of sound for others to experience, and opens up possibilities for its impacts on us, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
It's always so nerve-wracking when the artist is in the talk. So
thank you, Jessie, for bearing with us as we talk all about you.
I mean, Jessie, the work is really amazing, so thank you.
Absolutely. It's been absolutely wonderful to have this project with Jessie that's incredibly layered, that we can have all these conversations and that we can bring you in, Casey. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think that maybe what I can also say is that, like, my conceptualizing of sound is routed through, genealogies of queer theory and queer color critique, that use the experiences of sexually and racially marginalized communities as a method, as a method of critically analyzing social norms with larger goals of social justice, right? And so when I'm proposing that a sound is queer, I'm suggesting that if we listen to it more carefully, if we are grounded in the lessons that are laid out to us by queer theory and queer of color critique, then these sounds can hold transformative possibilities. So if we attune to them differently through queer methods of listening, and stop me if I'm talking too much, but methods of listening that tune us into our body, that make us think about vibration, to all forms of sensing, then we might reveal a different politics. They may be differently world making, to pull from Jose Munoz's beautiful work. But yeah, so I mean, like, queer people aren't erased from the scene when I'm talking about queer sound. Instead, queer people and queer theories are what hold it up. Yeah, I think I've babbled, but hopefully that helps to expand on my thinking around sound as a queer person, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a couple things came up for me in that, but I maybe will get to this question here. From Pauline that says, "Hi, wonderful talk. Thanks so much. I was wondering if you could elaborate a wee bit on the anti-identitarian tendency of queer theory on affect, if I heard that correctly. Also, mostly a comment, but thanks for sharing the bit about Sterling Road. This is the area I grew up in and still live in and walked by during the strike as well. So your video felt very close in proximity."
Right. Thank you, Pauline. I think I know Pauline. Thank you for that question. And so when I'm saying anti-identitarian tendency, I'm talking about the ways in which queerness is something that's difficult to pin down. I identify myself as queer because I neither find myself neatly fitting into the category of gay, lesbian, or whatever identity politics or identity categories exist. And so there's a way in which I am using the theory or the understanding of queerness in this way with sound, because I also think sound operates in a similar fashion, in that sound is a vibration that we can't really determine when it begins or when it ends, right? It's difficult to pin down if we think about it in this form. So I think there's like a really interesting kinship or relationship there between sound and queerness. And there's like something really like I think I'm not going to say empowering, but something really creative about thinking of queerness in this way.
Yeah, maybe I'll share a little bit about some of the sort of the research that I do that's personal to me, that we talked a little bit about, and how that relates to your work. Is that I'm very much interested in sort of like familial knowledge, embodied knowledge, and I'm very much influenced by the work of Diana Taylor, who's interested in coming in. So she does a sort of deep dive into knowledge and archives, and the way that sort of colonial forces have sort of normalized writing and histories in terms of writing, whereas if we go back in time, pre-colonial, so much knowledge and culture and sharing was embodied. It was sound, it was oral, it was singing, it was oral stories, it was dance. So there's definitely sort of a richness for me in terms of your practice and what we talk about in terms of like diasporic sounds and languages, and thinking that sort of counters these sort of hegemonic systems. And while that's very broad, I like using your work and Jesse's as a way to sort of hone in on language and talking the way that we sort of communicate at home with our mothers, and this sort of these sort of hegemonic control factors and influences. Like myself, I don't speak the same, my mother's first language. And so that, desire for our parents to sort of stop this sort of like trajectory of this, or this, sort of spoken tradition, is something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I feel like in all conversations, like moms come up. I feel like the mom is like a parental caring figure is always haunting the scene. But yeah, so like I recall those memories of my mother doesn't scold me in the same way that she used to when I was younger, but like I can still feel the force of those words being projected out towards me, right? Like there's like something that like the affect that was contained in these, in this simple phrase that I didn't understand as a child, right? Like my parents were, disciplining me in Tagalog because they didn't want me to know that they were swearing at me and like, like expressing frustration at me in this way. And so, it held such force, but like I became accustomed to knowing that, the force with which they were spoken held a particular meaning. And so this knowing but not knowing, I think, is an experience that you can be laid out across different diasporas, and is one that, if you're second generation and beyond, or like 1.5ers, or like however you imagine yourself in relation to an ancestral homeland, there's always that kind of tension, right, of knowing but not knowing. And this site of loss, I think, is so beautifully elaborated in Soleil, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm just going to go to the next question. So thank you so much for this conversation, Dr. Messia. You were actually my TA a few years ago.
I remember, yeah. Hi.
Yes, from Megan. Sorry, this is from Megan. I love the idea of sound as an archive of queer affect. I'm wondering, what do you think that sound can do uniquely as an archive of human experience in comparison to other mediums?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So sound uniquely as an archive of human experience in comparison to other mediums. I mean, I think that's a really great question. And I definitely think that sound allows a certain pedagogy that helps us to learn about ourselves and others, that resists histories of racialization, colonialism, and their gendered aspects, and helps us to form new relationships to, home, desire, and feelings of belonging. But as for it being an archive compared to other mediums, I think that, what sound does is it turns us to the body in different ways that perhaps, the visual medium does. There is so much emphasis of privileging the visual medium as the source of knowledge, right? What we see is what we know. But I think what sound does, it reminds us that there are other ways of knowing. There are other forms of knowing. There are other ways of sensing and producing knowledge. And I think an archive of sound can just remind us that, the domain of the visual is not the end all be all, that there are other ways of learning, knowing, communicating, so on. Megan, I hope you're doing okay. It's nice to see so many students.
Yes, thank you for that. We were actually, as TPW is a lens-based institution, and Annie and I, we're having a conversation about, exactly what you were saying, this sort of, just thinking about the importance of sound, and just like you said, its role in our life, and sound, listening individually versus collectively, and as a lens-based institution, thinking about the hierarchy of the visual, and if we're going to work more in sound, like in our exhibition capacities, like how do we sort of not necessarily rationalize that as a lens-based institution, but sort of, what conversations come up about, the relationship between the two things. So we're over time. This is our lunch hour talk. So if there's no more questions, we will wrap up. Just gonna look at my notes here, but I think we covered everything. Thank you so much again, Casey. This was so nice. It's a wonderful way to start Audibility and to sort of start the launch of Jessie's exhibition. Gallery TPW would like to thank TD Bank for their support and sponsorship of the Audibility program. So thank you, TD, and thank you everyone for joining. And Casey, take care, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.